Good morning. My name is Stephen Hale. I'm the chair of EFAC Australia as well as EFAC Global. Thank you for sharing with us in this training morning this morning. And we want to thank the Peter Corney Training Centre for assisting us in making this gathering possible. This morning I'm thinking about whether we're living in a new mission era or in fact this is just a bit of an inconvenience that we're going through at present. It has been suggested that there are four great eras of Christian history: the 500 years up until the fall of the Roman Empire, the 500 years up until the split between the East and the Western Church, the 500 years up until the Great Reformation, and then the 500 years up until at present. Now, if in fact we are living in a new mission era, there are plenty of reasons for thinking this could be the case. We're all familiar with the concept of living in a post-Christendom era. And we're also familiar with the fact that the church has shifted from the north to the south and from the west to the east. As an illustration, EFAC Nigeria has millions of members, and EFAC Australia has about 1,000 members, including quite a few people who are helping with this conference and others who aren't helping with this conference who could or should be members of EFAC Australia. I had the privilege a couple of years ago of attending an EFAC council meeting in Nairobi, where we reactivated EFAC Global after a 10-year kind of hiatus where nothing much had happened. And while we were in Nairobi, we participated in the opening of the CMS Africa office complex. It was kind of profound. Here we were on the site where CMS UK had operated for many, many years. And on that site, they'd built a new 8-storey building. That 8-storey building has been funded by African business people. CMS Africa has African leaders. They're seeking to work out how to do mission in Africa as well as out of Africa. Now they get a lot of support from the UK and other places, but nevertheless, it did seem to me to represent a pretty profound and significant shift that had taken place. Well, today I want to touch on 3 areas that I think are critical in terms of thinking about this new mission era. Firstly, riding the communication wave. We all know that we're in the middle of a communication revolution that is profound and significant. And this communication revolution involves continuous change and continuous adaptation. There are many, many things that we've all had to change and adapt to over the last 20 or 30 years, and we'll have to keep doing that because that's the nature of this revolution. Now, it's true to say that it's never been easier to connect with more people more easily and at relatively modest expense than it is at present. In my work with Overseas Council Australia, I've been working with a group called the Relay Trust in Cameroon. Amazingly, it's run by Danish missionaries, and their goal is to produce discipleship resources for people who will never have a computer, never have a laptop, never have an iPad, but do have a mobile phone. And using the WhatsApp app, they are seeking and developing discipleship resources that are connecting with literally millions of people at no expense to the people who are participating. Pretty amazing, don't you think about it? Now, to varying degrees, all of us, one way or another, have embraced this digital revolution. However, the incredible disruption of 2020 has caused all of us to fully embrace it, whether we wanted to or not. And you've got to ask the question, does this have ongoing implications? Are there things we'll be doing differently going forward? Have we discovered new opportunities? Have we been forced to see the future differently? And do we want to just get back to the way things always were, or do we want to embrace what people are calling the new normal? As Dominic Steele will talk about shortly, even getting back to the way things were isn't easy these days. It's pretty complicated because of all the restrictions and the requirements. So what might be some of the things we need to be thinking about in this space? Well, I'm by no means an expert because, as you can see, I'm pretty old and I'm not someone who's all that digitally adept myself. But the last 5 months, I think, have forced all of us to embrace the digital revolution. The option has existed for many years, and in the main, we weren't all that excited about it. But here we are in August 2020, and we all have stories to tell. Things have dropped off a bit, I know, in recent months, but in the initial phase, churches were getting 100% attendance. I mean, that never happens in what we used to regard as normal times. All of us have learned a whole lot of new things, and we're all aware of both the complexities and the challenges. Now, everyone I've spoken to has surprising stories to tell of things that have happened, of people they've connected with, of things that have gone on that they didn't ever anticipate or never had thought of that could emerge out of this crisis. and therefore there's a lot of key learnings and key opportunities that have presented themselves. Seemingly older people have embraced the technology of meeting with in church online better than younger people have. And in fact, there's a big challenge in sustaining youth ministry in the current context. And there's an important conversation happening later about that. People who ordinarily wouldn't go to small group for a myriad of reasons are now able to go all the time, whether they're travelling or whether they're sick and at home, or whether they've got little children, and it's just a lot easier to participate that way. Doing Alpha online works in a way that has been surprising and connects, in often cases, with more people. So at present we've been making do, but in next year's planning and next year's budgeting, you may want to put some time and money into this. It's an investment in connecting with new people in new ways. I'm hoping and praying it will be creative and open to lots of new possibilities. But secondly, a bigger mission vision. Now, most churches these days have a vision statement, and most dioceses have a vision statement. Many of them are so broad and wide that you could fit almost anything under the heading. But leaders, whether they're bishops or clergy or lay leaders, need to work together to pray and discern God's vision for his church generally and their particular community of faith. Now, unfortunately, a lot of time, many churches are internally self-preoccupied and self-concerned. And there's a whole lot of reasons why that is the case, which we don't need to dwell on. A decade of heavy-handed compliance directives from dioceses has sapped a lot of energy. Now, I know most of those things had to be attended to, but some of the ways in which they have been attended to have been pretty enervating. But in spite of this, I believe that at present the Holy Spirit is blowing to urge and inspire us to radically change from being come-to churches to become go-to churches. Our churches must be mission-driven rather than ministry-driven. The old distinction between ministry and mission, ministry is service to me, and mission is service through me, I think is as good today as when it was first introduced. People, if they're going to invest in the life of the local church, will increasingly want to be a part of a community of faith that has a sense of emerging clarity of how we're participating together in the mission of God in both our local context, in terms of the city or region where we're located, in terms of the country in which we're located, but as well as that in a global sense, because we're all global citizens and we want to be a part of what's going on globally. They'll want to be able to participate in this mission and not just sit passively in the pews. And I think there's a very big conversation to be had in that space. Related to this will be clarity about how we seek to make mature and mobilize disciples of Christ. So how do we make disciples, and how do we help people to keep on growing in maturity? And how do we help people to sense that they're a part of God's mission in God's world as they live out their faith in all of their lives? Now, we need to invite the lay people in our churches into a conversation about what that looks like. Our people want to be affirmed and equipped to do the mission that God's invited them to be a part of in all of their lives. They have the gifts and they've got the abilities given to them by God, and they have the personal connections with large numbers of people. So how do we as ministers affirm people in the mission that they already have in that space? But as well as that, how do we actually band together as God's people in local churches to do mission together? And my hunch is, and conviction is, that it's still through a reimagining of what small groups are and how small groups function. If you've got 5, 10, 15 small groups, just imagine if each of those groups were doing something intentional for the sake of others, rather than just meeting to actually care for and support one another. And thirdly and finally in all of this, doing good deeds. A couple of years ago we did a preaching series at St Hilary's on the little book of Titus. And it struck me that again and again, Paul's, in a sense, exhortation was for people to do good deeds. And I think if churches are going to connect locally, have an impact locally, we've got to be increasingly involved in serving people actively in our local communities. During the COVID crisis, there's a church near where we live that has lots of international students living in that context. So they've recalibrated their annual food drive to be giving out food packages to those international students and forging significant connections. I think any church these days will need to be thinking creatively and imaginatively about how we care and how we offer concern in a really targeted way to have an impact in our community. Well, are we at the beginning of a new mission era? Well, we probably won't know the answer to that question for quite a long time. But in the meantime, we live in a crossover era and God's inviting us into something new. Let's all be open to new possibilities and see what God was going to do in and through us.
Hello everyone, Adam Lowe here from St Bart's in Toowoomba, and it is a great privilege to join with you today for the Pivot Conference, especially as we think about strategic opportunities for ministry in and through the crisis. Let me begin by saying that I know right now, especially in places like Melbourne and other hotspots around the country, that things are really tough. Personally, I just want to assure you that here at St Bart's, we are praying for you as a community. We're praying for you as leaders, and it is such a privilege to be able to come together today and take a step back and consider if this season is just a giant pothole, or is it an opportunity to pivot and shape the way that we want to carry things into the future for God's glory. The current crisis has precipitated a rate of change in our churches and other ministry contexts like nothing seen before. So often when introducing change, so much pre-work has to be done. As leaders and in communities, we have to create an environment, a readiness for change. It's what Lowe, in his classic model of change, calls unfreezing. But that in this current season, that just hasn't been necessary. That hasn't had to be done because the change, it's been thrust upon us in response to the environment, in response to the crisis. But when the rate of change plateaus, as it has in some places right now, and as it will in other places in the future, the natural inertia is for things to get back to normal, or at least the way things were. Our church is a bit like a rubber band that has been stretched, and it looks a bit different right now. But as soon as there are triggers, as soon as there are relaxations and allowances and regulations, it's a bit like letting go of the rubber band, and the natural inertia is that things will snap back to normal. But what if this stage right now was not a holding pattern, but that it was a readying stage that was causing us to prepare for whatever God has in store? I think there are four scenarios with which you can think about what future ministry may look like. There are all sorts of futures, of course. It doesn't just have to be back to the way things were. So I'd love to step you through those and hope that they are helpful. The first scenario is the classic one of recover. And the key question in this scenario is, how do we get back to the way things were? That's incremental step change, that as regulations allow, that things will be stepped back in order to get back to that baseline of how things were previously. That can be our natural longing, the natural longing of our communities as well. Perhaps people are grieving that and wanting that right now. The second scenario is reinvention. The reinvention scenario assumes that everything is actually going to look completely different after the crisis. And so that doesn't mean changing back to the way things were, but actually an acceleration of change so that things would even look more different to the way things do right now. I know that would be really scary for many of us to consider, but that's what the scenario looks at. And so the key question at the heart of the scenario is, what brand new place shall we go? The third scenario is what I call reframe. And the question at the heart of the scenario is, what can we learn and adopt? This scenario assumes that much of what we long to go back to is actually right. It's a core part of who we are in ministry and mission, and we will get back to that. But that actually this is also a strategic opportunity for change along the way. In some major research released by Bart earlier in the year, churches ranked digital engagement as one of the lowest priorities for them to consider, only for them a few weeks later, in fact almost every church in the world, to have to respond to COVID and launch online services and ministry just a few weeks later. So this scenario considers, what can we learn and adopt? The fourth scenario is release. And the question at the heart of this scenario is, how do we finish well? That the organisation, actually, if we're honest, at the end of its life cycle, the crisis has been a catalyst to highlight that, perhaps ask questions that have never been asked before, or be confronted by realities that no one has previously dared consider. And so now leaders in the community are asking, or beginning to ask, how can we finish well? When we think about those four scenarios, I think for most churches, the scenario that we are most likely in is reframe. And so we're asking the question, in most cases, what can we learn and adopt as we step forward into the future? Now, there are many ways to approach that, but I think one helpful way to approach that is by asking a series of questions. And before we even look at the questions, I want to encourage you that don't just do this alone, because really the most effective way to approach this would be to work through these questions with your staff, if you have a staff team, and certainly with all of your, or some of your key leaders, depending on the size of your church. So your staff, if you have staff, and also with your key leaders. So as you think about your mission context, 3 key questions that would be helpful for you to consider, both as a leader, but also as you consider the various aspects of ministry. So think in both of those dimensions for all 3 questions, as a leader and also for various ministries. And so those 3 questions are, first, what have you stopped? Now in this season, the question is, what have you stopped? I'm not just talking about things that you've stopped, that you're really delighted that you've stopped and you never want to go back to because you don't want to do them personally. But what have you stopped in this period that actually you don't want to go back to because they're not helpful to you as a leader, or they're not helpful to your mission in your local setting? So that's the first question. The second question is, what have you changed? What have you changed in this period? Recognising that you can't possibly do everything, you just can't keep adding things on, but what have you changed that has been really helpful to you as a leader, or your mission that you think would be really great to continue? That's the second question. The third question is, what have you started in this season? What has been brand new? What has been so helpful to you as a leader or in the mission of your local community that you would like to adopt and continue into this next stage as we step forward? So thinking with the ideal future in mind, what do you set in place now to continue along that path? So they're the 3 questions to reflect on as you think about scenario C, if that's where you're at, on reframe, what can we learn and adopt? And I want to say, think about those questions both as a leader, remember, but also for your various aspects of ministry. I'm so thankful to God for all of you and for the extraordinary way in which the Lord has been at work and continues to be at work, even in this very trying season. And I'm also personally so thankful for the ways in which it's been possible to learn from each other and to continue learning from each other as we all, in our various settings, seek to make and mature disciples of Jesus.
Hey, thanks so much for having me along today. I just wanted to acknowledge, stating right up front the obvious, that across Australia there is a whole variety of different situations, and the context in Victoria is of course very different to Western Australia, Northern Territory, Queensland, Tassie, and even here in New South Wales. And the context we're each in has radically changed and changed again. And a lot of us are dealing with the difficulty of disappointment, the difficulty of carefully leading our people in making plans and then having them not come to fruition. And then we go through that process again, carefully leading and making plans, and then the situation changes again. And so we've got disappointment fatigue. Now, whatever your immediate situation, on the one hand, you could be in the West Australian, Queensland situation, or in Victoria. As we go forward, there's an important principle that we need to grasp. And for those of you in Victoria, this isn't your immediate question, but God willing, it will be in 6 weeks' time. I think there needs to be a philosophical shift for Australian business leaders, Australian church leaders, the Australian community, and I suspect much more widely as well. Instead of leading for recovery, we now need to plan to lead for endurance. And we need to start using that catch cry, that expression, to set our people's expectations right. Not recovery, but endurance. When the Prime Minister spoke in May And he gave us the sense that we'd all be at meetings of 100 by the end of July. We were pretty much, wow, that's fantastic, that's faster than we thought, that's terrific. And then the various state governments were kind of falling over themselves, getting giddy with excitement of announcing the easing of restrictions in late June, kind of as quickly as they could, out machoing each other. And I think a few of us at the end of June, we got caught in that rush of excitement. And 6 weeks later, how much has changed? Now, as I talk with other church leaders, friends who are pastors, some of quite large churches, I've realised there's two different mindsets. I was talking to one on Monday, and he's at a leading church in Sydney, and really they're on life support, and not so much financially, but in terms of doing the ministry that they're able to do pre-COVID. And some pastors still have it in their heads, a plan of trajectory back towards recovery. How can we get back to where we were? I mean, taking on board what's been said about adaptive change and things like that, but how can we get back to physical meetings? And really, that's the line that we were thinking, even back in June. We were excited about recovery, excited about, and yes, we had a little niggling open question in the back of our minds about, once we got people predominantly back in the building, how much effort should we put into the live streaming of services and that whole online ministry? But now, having had 5 Sundays back in the building and the little spot fires across New South Wales and anxiety levels, I so much want to keep meeting physically. But the other position, the endurance position, is, I think, wiser to plan for this. The big outbreak in Victoria has, I think, caused a rethink. The rhetoric of the government has changed. The language coming out of National Cabinet is that they have re-endorsed the suppression strategy, not the elimination strategy. They're not trying to eliminate the virus in Australia, they're trying to suppress it in Australia. Now, if it's suppression, not elimination, that means, I think, that we can expect localised kinds of outbreaks, the kinds we've been seeing in New South Wales the last fortnight, to continue on and off for the foreseeable future as the virus waxes and wanes in the community. And therefore, anxiety levels will go up and down, and the anxiety levels and risk levels will vary in the different areas. It's not going to go away. Recovery's not in sight. Back to normal's not going to happen anytime soon, which means we as church leaders, planning wisely for a level of virus in the community, an ongoing level of anxiety in our communities, in our church membership constituencies, as we apply that principle, I think we'll best be served by having a long-term strategy of expecting in our adult ministries, some people will want to be present physically in the building. And look, spiritually, that's far better for their own good to be present physically. But on the other hand, some will only be prepared to either gather in smaller home group sizes or just on their own at home. And actually, some of that caution is going to be reasonable, is going to be health related. Some people are in high risk groups, some might be exhibiting symptoms, some might have runny-nosed kids, and whereas another year they might have pushed through, in this season, people rightly are choosing to stay home and engage online. And so, and actually we should expect the percentage of our membership that will go either in the building physically or online, that's going to vary. It's going to go up and down depending on the prevalence of the virus, their own risk status, the risk status of somebody close to them, just general anxiety levels. But that endurance strategy, that's really going to be the reality for the next 18 months. We've got to make strategic and budget decisions in line with it, expecting the physical and online ministries. It's going to mean creating smaller public meetings and parallel live streaming ministry. Now, I'm looking around and seeing some people doing online really well, whether pre-recorded or live, and I see that some have gone back to live physical meetings. But I think the sooner that we each work out how to do the two ministries in parallel, to develop the gifts, to invest in the technology, to learn as Bible teachers, to simultaneously communicate to those live in the room and those live on the broadcast, each of us are going to be better off. I don't think there's going to be a moment soon where we're back live, when streaming is over, when we can celebrate the party, when we can move on from the nightmare, the virus is going to wax and wane, on and off. Anxiety levels are going to wax and wane, on and off. Physical attendance levels are going to wax and wane, on and off. And we're going to have to learn to do both. I mean, we know we can do both. We know we can do live service. We know we can do the streaming. It's just doing them both at the same time. And I'm saying so much easier, so much cheaper to do them simultaneously. I think the pre-recorded thing just takes so much longer. And I think actually the live makes the viewer feel so much more part of it. So I think for the adult ministries, we just need to toughen up and learn to do them simultaneously. The choices, I think, are easier in the kids ministry. The choices in the kids and youth ministry can be binary because the schools set a lead and we churches can follow that lead. If the schools are live, then the kids ministries can be physically live. If the schools are online, then the kids ministries can be online. And we can say to parents, actually, drop a kid off, just like you drop them off at school, pick them up at the end, but don't hang around like the church gate like you don't hang around the school gate. But I don't think we have that choice of the binary in the adult ministry. And some weeks we're going to end up almost all online, and some weeks we're going to end up predominantly physical. So how does this all play out in terms of the adult ministry? Well, just like we made the shift from overhead projectors to data projectors, from data projectors to LED screens, from analog sound desks to digital sound desks, we're going to have to make, from audio podcasts to streaming videos of conferences, we're going to have to make another shift. We need to plan for endurance. Now, having said that in principle, I don't like it. I don't like it theologically. Any time a Christian can't gather physically with their brothers and sisters, I think that's a spiritual tragedy. We are the body of Christ together. It's not good for a man to be alone. We're connected to each other and to our head, Christ. And you can't be the church if you aren't connected physically. And you can't be truly connected if you don't gather and if you don't physically meet. And so I don't like it. I don't like it theologically. I don't like it pragmatically in terms of its effectiveness of proclaiming Christ. There's a world going to hell. Their only hope is the clear proclamation of the Lord Jesus. The best online ministry is not as effective as an in-person ministry. We know that. So I don't like it, but I think it's necessary. I think we have to acknowledge that and then do it. It's the reality that we live in. So some bullet points for going forward. Sundays. Restart Sunday physical meetings as soon as you're able to within the health department guidelines. Don't wait for a better day. And note, not everyone's going to come on the first day. And any kind of startup you do, it's going to be raggedy. Expect that. Don't be disappointed when it isn't. And don't look at photos from the same time last year of everybody gathered happily together in church. Do plan for a parallel structure with ebbs and flows between the two. If you wait for the perfect day, it's just never going to come. So as soon as the health department guidelines allow you, just start. Now, we've been going 5 or 6 weeks on a Sunday. I'm praising God actually that our evening church physical attendance is pretty much back to pre-COVID levels. And surprisingly, actually, as we've gone back physically, our evening online audience has only dropped by a third. I can't actually work that one out. Sunday morning, physical attendance is 50-60% of what it was. We started higher with around 66%, but as the anxiety levels have gone back up in New South Wales in the last few weeks, attendance has slipped again. And my hunch is there's 20% of our people who we won't see in the building for 18 months, perhaps more. There's another 20 to 30% who are going to ebb and flow between the online and the physical. And potentially, physically, those staying home are safer, but spiritually I think they're worse off. And they're going to be worse off the longer they stay online. We know that's true. We know people don't concentrate as well online. At best, it's a ventilator. Now, maturity. In terms of Bible study groups, community groups, the churches with highly developed pastoral care structures, with the highest percentages of members in Bible study community groups before COVID, who are able to continue to roll out pastoral care along those pre-existing structures, my observation is they seem to be weathering this best. And we going forward I think we're going to need to do that in the two different parallel structures. So the sense I'm getting from talking to other pastors is that for many churches around my area of the world, Bible study community groups linked to evening congregations, many have restarted in real life, physically, whereas the groups linked to morning congregations, it's much less clear. Perhaps 50% still online, 50% back live. For us, we went through our morning church community group role and we realised that there's some members in each group that wants to meet physically who would prefer to be online, and some members who are in online groups who would prefer to be physically meeting. And actually, if this is not going to go on for 3 months, if it's going to go on for 18 months, and we've got a plan for endurance, not recovery, we'd be wise to talk to those members who'd rather a physical group, but the rest of the group wants to meet online and vice versa. We need to have a conversation about you changing groups. But then we need to support and encourage the parallel structure of the physical meeting and the online meeting. Now, in terms of connection, if your goal is recovery and you're reopening physically, then you'll wind back a few of the support structures that you've been doing for the online ministries. But if your goal is endurance and you have a significant percentage still involved online, not physically, you'll want to continue to work on strategies for connecting online with new people going forward. And actually there's a real opportunity now you're meeting physically to keep pushing ahead with the online connection ministries. I checked with our membership connection pastor and she said between March the 15th and mid-July, we'd had 194 people give us their contact details through the online COVID season. And we've seen 8 of those make it physically to church, and not just physically to church, but into either a weeknight group or a Introducing God group. And actually, the Introducing God course that starts next week for us, I think we got 15 people expected, and many of them are people who've watched during COVID and we've connected with them. They've come to physical church and are now going to go to that course. Community. Coming back together. It seems like the advice of the New South Wales Health Department here is going to be for groups of less than 10 for pubs, clubs and cafes. I think that's got implications for church, that we want to encourage in the after church time, not widespread mingling, but rather going deeper with a few. So we're encouraging people to grab a coffee from the coffee person, then go and sit down, talk with a group, rather than stand around and flit between large numbers of people. But as we restart physical community after church, we've had to get a new parallel team created to take the lead in the online community structures. We need to think, I can't just have one structure or the other. We need to be doing both because we're planning for endurance. We've got to set up the flex so that people can ebb and flow between the structures. Now, I'm super worried about the spiritual battle. I know there are some who are in high-risk groups. I know there are some where the anxiety issues are super real, and I know there are significant health risks. But I think for some there is a spiritual war going on, but the presentation is physical. The devil has lied to some of our people, and what an effective lie. Don't go to the place where the word of God is. That will kill you. We need to pray for our people that they resist that lie of the devil, that they don't believe that lie. And for some of them, we need to call it, to name it, to pastor them, to shepherd them, to let them know if you go for 18 months believing that lie on that trajectory, I'm not so sure you'll be standing at the end.